The wind howled like a wounded animal across the frozen plains of Montana, carving ghostly shapes through the endless drifts of snow. In the heart of that cold, desolate land stood a weathered cabin, its wood blackened by decades of brutal winters. Inside, beside a stubborn fire that hissed and spat in the stone hearth, sat Walter Briggs, a man of 73 winters, a veteran, a widower, and a soul slowly fading into the quiet. Walter's days were long and muted. His only companions were memories, a sepia-toned photograph of his late wife, Anna, smiling gently from a cracked frame on the mantel, and a dusty box filled with medals and folded letters from wars fought long ago. His hands, rough and calloused, from years of labor and battle, shook slightly as he turned the pages of a worn leather journal, a habit he kept to fend off the crushing loneliness. Outside, the blizzard thickened. Snow battered the small windows like a siege, and the trees groaned under the weight of ice. Walter stood stiffly, feeling the pull in his knees, and poured himself a cup of black coffee, the steam briefly fogging the deep lines on his face. It was in that heavy, aching stillness that he heard it, a whimper, faint, barely a thread against the roaring wind. Walter stiffened, tilting his head toward the door. Another whimper, almost swallowed by the storm. He set down the coffee, grabbed his heavy coat and lantern, and stepped out into the white fury. The cold struck him like a hammer. His boots crunched over the deep snow as he pushed forward, lantern swinging wildly in the gale. He followed the sound, heart-pounding, memories of battlefield cries flashing unbidden in his mind, and there, against a skeletal birch tree half buried in a drift, he saw it, a German shepherd, chained cruelly to the trunk, its ribs sharp against its matted fur, its eyes glassy and full of pain. The dog tried to stand but collapsed into the snow with a pitiful whine. Walter's breath caught in his throat. "Easy, boy. Easy now," he rasped, voice rough with emotion. He stumbled forward, his fingers fumbling at the frozen chain, cursing under his breath. The metal was like fire against his skin. It took everything he had to snap the rusted links free with an old hunting knife he kept at his belt. The dog sagged against him, too weak to move. Walter gathered the trembling creature into his arms, feeling the frailty, the dying weight, and carried him back toward the faint golden light of the cabin. The storm screamed in protest, tearing at them, but Walter gritted his teeth and pushed on. Inside, he laid the dog before the fire, wrapping him in an old woolen blanket. The shepherd didn't move, save for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. Walter worked methodically, thawing ice from the fur, rubbing life into stiff limbs. He spooned water gently into the dog's mouth, whispered broken assurances that neither fully understood but both desperately needed. "You're not dying on me, son," Walter muttered, his voice cracking. "You're not alone anymore." He didn't sleep that night. He sat by the fire, watching over the battered soul he had pulled from death's grasp, the bond already stitching itself silently between them. The storm raged on, but inside that cabin, something fragile and precious was beginning to heal. Morning came slowly, painting the snowdrifts in shades of cold blue and pale gold. Walter dozed fitfully in his chair, waking with a start when he heard a soft shuffle. The dog, somehow still alive, had lifted his head. For a long, breathless moment, man and dog simply looked at each other. Those deep, sorrowful brown eyes held a story of suffering Walter didn't need words to understand. He had seen that same look before in the mirror, after Anna's funeral. In the faces of the men who didn't make it home. Walter cleared his throat. "Well, look at you, got some fight left, huh?" He reached out slowly, letting the dog catch his scent, and after a tense beat, the shepherd let his weary head sink into Walter's hand. A shudder ran through him from relief, from some ancient part of him that remembered what it was to trust. "Ranger," Walter said suddenly, the name falling naturally from his lips. "That's what I'll call you. You look like a damn fine ranger. To me." And so it was. The first days were touch and go. Ranger barely moved, too weak to stand, but Walter fed him broth from a ladle and kept the fire roaring high. He combed the burrs from the dog's coat, speaking softly all the while about the mountains, the cabin, Anna, the war, the long years since. Ranger always listened. The cabin, once so oppressively silent, seemed fuller now, even when No words were spoken. At night, Walter would sit at the old pine table, penning entries in his journal while Ranger dozed by the hearth, the fire painting both of them in shades of gold and shadow. Slowly, Ranger grew stronger. First a tentative step, then two. Then a low, wagging thump of the tail whenever Walter entered the room. Walter found himself laughing again, rusty, broken laughter at first, but laughter all the same. Each morning, he would bundle up and Ranger would follow him outside, the dog's paws kicking up little sprays of powder as they trudged through the snow. They explored the woods together, the gnarled trees, the frozen creek, the abandoned trapper's cabin, 2 ridges over. Ranger never strayed far, always keeping Walter within sight. At night, they shared meals, Walter's simple stews and biscuits, Ranger's portion carefully set in an old tin dish. Afterward, they would sit by the fire, Walter with a battered book in hand, Ranger curled at his feet. Sometimes Walter would talk aloud about the memories that haunted him, the battles, the mistakes, the things he wished he'd said to Anna before she slipped away. Ranger never judged. He only listened, sometimes resting his great head against Walter's knee as if to say, "I'm here. You're not alone anymore." The cabin walls, once oppressive in their silence, now echoed with the small, precious sounds of life, the scratch of paws on wood, the soft jingle of Ranger's makeshift collar, the slow, steady breathing of 2 souls who had found each other in the wilderness of grief. It was 2 weeks later, during one of their longer walks, that trouble came. Walter had taken them down toward the frozen river, the late afternoon sun slicing through the trees in cold silver shafts. Ranger ranged ahead a few yards, nose to the ground. Walter heard the growl first low, rumbling, feral. A flash of movement, a coyote, mangy and starving, slinking from the shadows. Another and another. A whole pack, desperate in the lean winter months. Walter's heart thudded in his chest. He raised his walking stick, yelling, trying to scare them off, but they were too hungry to be cowed. The first coyote lunged, and Ranger was there. The dog exploded into motion, a snarl tearing from his throat as he threw himself between Walter and the attackers. Teeth flashed, blood sprayed on the snow. Walter swung his stick wildly, but it was Ranger who fought like a creature possessed, driving the coyotes back with savage determination. When it was over, the pack fled, yipping and snarling into the trees. Ranger stood trembling, a deep gash along his flank, his chest heaving. Walter dropped to his knees in the snow, tears burning his eyes. "You damn fool," he whispered hoarsely, cradling the dog's great head in his arms. "You saved me." He carried Ranger home that night, whispering promises and thanks into the cold, brittle air. Back at the cabin, he cleaned the wounds with trembling hands, speaking the whole time, not because Ranger needed the words, but because Walter needed to say them. "You're my best boy, you hear me? My best boy." And somewhere in the long night, while the fire cracked and the wind moaned at the windows, Ranger thumped his tail weakly against the floor, a heartbeat in the darkness. Spring struggled against winter's grip. The snow melted in patches, revealing the damp, stubborn earth beneath. Trees budded shyly. Birds returned, their songs tentative at first, as if unsure if the world was ready to bloom again. Walter and Ranger healed together during that slow thaw. The wound on Ranger's side knitted itself closed, leaving a scar that matched the ones Walter bore on his own battered body. They were old soldiers, both of them, marked but unbroken. Their routine settled into a comfortable rhythm. Each morning, after a breakfast of eggs and bacon, a strip always set aside for Ranger, they would head down to the river trail. Walter, leaning on his sturdy stick, and Ranger, his ears perked, tail wagging slow and steady. They fished when the ice broke, Ranger sitting patiently at Walter's side, eyes fixed on the lazy eddies of the stream. They chopped wood together well, Walter chopped, and Ranger supervised with solemn dignity. They wrote letters too, or rather, Walter did, penning long notes to distant family members who rarely replied, while Ranger snoozed by the hearth. Evenings were for quiet, for reading, or sometimes just staring into the fire while old records played scratchy tunes from a battered gramophone in the corner. Sinatra, Hank Williams, Patsy Cline. It was a life built not on noise but on understanding, and gradually the town began to notice. When Walter went into town for supplies, people would see him not alone anymore, but with a proud German shepherd trotting faithfully. At his side, at Henderson's general store, Ranger would sit by the counter, eyes watchful but gentle. Kids would creep close, hands outstretched, and after a cautious sniff, Ranger would permit a pet, his tail giving an approving thump. Word spread. Old. Walter's got a dog now, folks said. Looks like he's found a reason to stick around. A local teenager, Tommy Brooks, snapped a picture one crisp afternoon. Walter, in his worn flannel jacket, standing by the town war memorial with Ranger sitting proudly at his heel, the American flag snapping above them. Tommy posted it online with a simple caption, "Two heroes still standing watch." The post went viral in their small Montana town. Then further, people were drawn to it, the loyalty, the dignity, the quiet strength in that simple moment. Veterans groups reached out. Local news stations ran a story. Letters came, strangers writing to say thank you, to say they were inspired by Walter and Ranger's story. Some even made the trek up to the cabin, bringing dog treats, homemade pies, knitted blankets. Walter, who had lived so long wrapped in the quiet ache of isolation, found himself wrapped now in something else. Community, hope, belonging. The seasons spun faster now, as they do when life finds its rhythm. Another year turned. Walter turned 75. Ranger's muzzle grew grayer, his joints a little stiffer, but his spirit remained unbowed. The snow returned, blanketing the world in silence once more. One night, as they sat by the fire, Walter penned a final letter, not to distant family, but to Ranger. He read it aloud, voice low and cracking. "To my dearest friend, you came to me when I had nothing left. You gave me purpose when all I wanted was to fade away. You listened when no one else could hear. You stood between me and the darkness, fearless and faithful. You are not just a good dog, Ranger. You are the best of all of us. Thank you for saving me." He folded the letter carefully, setting it inside his journal. Ranger lifted his head, thumping his tail once. Walter smiled. "I'm tired, boy," he said softly. "Might be time for my watch to end." That night, under a heavy quilt stitched long ago by Anna's hands, Walter drifted into sleep with Ranger curled tight against his side, the fire casting long, dancing shadows on the cabin walls. When neighbors found the cabin days later, after Walter failed to show up in town for supplies, they discovered the old man peaceful in his bed, a faint smile still ghosting his lips, and at his side, head resting on Walter's chest, lay Ranger, silent, unmoving. He had stayed. He had kept his final watch. They buried Walter in the small cemetery overlooking the valley he loved, and it felt right because everyone knew it could be no other way, they buried Ranger beside him. The town turned out in force. Veterans in full dress uniforms saluted as the coffins were lowered. Children threw handfuls of wildflowers into the graves. The town preacher spoke not just of loss, but of loyalty, of healing, of the sacred bond between two broken souls who had found each other when they needed it most. A plaque was placed at the War Memorial later that spring. It read simply, "Walter Briggs, 1949 to 2025, Ranger loyal friend." They kept the watch. They kept the faith. And sometimes on cold winter nights, when the wind howls across the frozen plains, folks swear they can see two figures walking the ridge, one man, one dog standing sentinel over the land they loved, side by side, forever. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to leave a like, share it with someone who believes in loyalty and healing, and subscribe for more timeless stories. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and tell us what loyalty means to you. Thank you for keeping the spirit of Walter and Ranger alive.